Hi everyone, sorry this video is a little late. I'm trying something different this week since Players Cup 4 was over the weekend and reviewing all the sets I played. I managed to win 4 sets before being statistically eliminated, which I believe puts me somewhere in the top 48 to 79 players for North America, depending on how you count players that dropped early, so I'm really happy with that. I went a little boring and I used a Sunroom team that was heavily based on a team used by 2 very successful players named North and Jackson, and it also features Regirock and Zapdos. I did a good number of tweaks to the team, mostly on the EVs and moves, entirely on the EVs and moves. It is the same 6 mods. So the first big thing I did was I boosted Porygon 2's speed to outspeed a Garchomp at +2. This can be a really big deal against both Garchomp and Landorus after hitting a couple of Zapdos' Airstreams or Max Strikes from Porygon 2 itself. I then proceeded to boost my Venusaur's speed from what North and Jackson were doing to beat out all modest Regielekis under Sun. I found this helped me a lot in practice because modest Regieleki has become really popular recently due to all the success of like the Life Orb plus either Gothitelle or Clefairy. I gave my Regirock Ice Punch and Protect over what they chose, which was Curse and High Horsepower. I wasn't getting many opportunities to set up Curse, and I already had a good deal of ground coverage between Venusaur and Torkoal. I also boosted its attack investment, and that helps to some degree to make up for the lack of Curse, but we did depend on Max Knuckles quite a bit. I also readjusted my Zapdos' bulk to not give opposing Porygon 2s a download boost, because the special defense is higher than the regular defense. But it still lives a Glastrier max Hailstorm while it's max itself 94% of the time. So it's still effectively the same on the defensive calcs. It also has a bit more special attack investment than theirs because Safety Goggles and a Timid Nature left me feeling like the damage output was just lacking. Finally, I made my Grimmsnarl considerably more specially bulky. This was to help live a Helping Hand max strike from a Spectrier. Dual Horse has been a relatively popular archetype throughout all of Series 9, and this was a key part of my game plan, even though I didn't fight it in the tournament. It's also got just enough speed to beat an Urshifu at +2, because they tend to come out in the end game, so if I get 2 Airstreams off from Zapdos and they bring out an Urshifu, Spirit Break can be very helpful there. Anyway, that's the team. Let's jump in, because there's a lot to get through. Okay, so for my first set, my opponent has almost exactly the same team as me, just swapping in Goggles Rotom-H for Goggles Zapdos, which performs exactly the same role as an anti-Sun Mirror. I decided to make the read that my opponent would assume I was going with my own Sun counter and counter that with their Regirock. The best counter to that I have is Venusaur, so I went with that. I decided to pair with P2 because it would give me the flexibility to set Trick Room for Regirock should I guess wrong and they open with Rotom, but also at absolute worst, Venu P2 is very solid in the mirror. Luckily, I guessed right. They chose to open with Regirock, so we're in an amazing position typing-wise. Plus, P2 gets its download boost right off of Regirock and Grimmsnarl coming out. I ended up deciding to take a risk and click Vine Lash into Regirock, but I also put Tri-Attack into that slot, because despite the typing advantage, just in case they do a defensive switch into Torkoal or Rotom-H, we'll still get big damage off into it. And of course, if they don't switch, it's still at +1, and it has the chance for status effects. This game keeps going our way as they predict a Sleep Powder and go for Taunt while maxing their Regirock. We get a full power Vine Lash off of their Regirock, plus a Tri-Attack, although we don't get any status conditions off of it. They'll go for a Hailstorm in return, and that does really hurt, don't get me wrong, but because we've chosen to max, we're still alive and in solid shape because we have speed control, especially since Vine Lash is up for that residual damage. After this point, we'll just get to finish them off on the following turn. After their Regirock is down, we get a very straightforward max boost into Grimm to boost P2, and then we can put a +2 Tri-Attack into their P2 that they bring in to replace their Regirock. Notably, they do live this and get an Ice Beam off into Venusaur, but it lives to tell the tale while also taking off the Taunt, which opens up Sleep Powder as an option. With Grimm gone, they bring their Venusaur out, and Sleep Powder means this game isn't over yet. Crucially, they hit their Sleep Powder on our P2 while we miss our powder on theirs, and that's just the nature of this mirror matchup, unfortunately. To make matters worse, our Venusaur dies to Hail Chip this turn, so it's effectively a dead turn for us. Meanwhile, their Porygon recovers its HP. Luckily for us, the following turn we protect Regirock from an incoming Sleep Powder, and RP2 gets the 1-turn Wake Up. That's huge because it's a +2 Ice Beam coming from there, so it's a ton of damage onto their Venusaur. Their P2 will get an Eerie Impulse off, but at this point it's too late. The next turn, we're just going to be able to double in with Ice Punch and Ice Beam, and since I know their Venusaur doesn't have Protect, I'm guaranteeing the kill. Now, they do kill Regirock with their +2 Leaf Storm on the weakness policy, but we have Torkoal in the back, so after this Ice Beam to kill the Venusaur, it's almost guaranteed to be over. We get a free Protect Trick Room, followed by Eruption and Tri-Attack spam into winning the first game. Now, for Game 2, I decided to read that they would try to adapt to my Venusaur Porygon 2 lead, and go with their Sun counter, which is Rotom-H, which makes Regirock my lead of choice. While P2 is a solid partner for setting up Trick Room, I decided I wanted to hedge my bets with Grimmsnarl in case I went up against their Regirock. They opted for Life Orb while we have Weakness Policy and Max Knuckle, so that mirror is in my favor if I have Screen, since I'm completely safe to hit them with super effective attacks. I then hedge my bets for them bringing Venusaur by bringing my own Zapdos in the back, and then P2 for Trick Room support. So we called the leads perfectly, and they opened with Rotom-H, but there was absolutely no way they chose to keep Rotom-H in against Regirock, and Regirock isn't that strong without boosts, so I decided to read the switch and go for a Max Knuckle in that slot. I also go for Spirit Break into their Grim because Regirock was feeling no offensive pressure, so I can always set screens on a later turn. This worked perfectly with the switch into P2, so we get a super effective Knuckle that boosts our HP. Now, here I make the mistake of using Max Rockfall into P2, with the faulty assumption that I could kill after the +1. But A, it's speedy enough to recover, and B, they just use this turn to set up Reflect. So another Knuckle was definitely the play here, because those two factors mean we're never getting the KO anyway. Luckily, we're given another chance this turn. We don't make the mistake again. Predicting a recover, I use Max Knuckle into the P2, and with our knowledge that our Grimmsnarl is faster than theirs, I take it out with a Spirit Break. They do get a Light Screen up in the meantime, but that is okay as we get our +2 with Max Knuckle before our Max ends. Now, I wouldn't say that we're in an amazing position since we did trade our Max for just end most of our Grimm's health for just a single KO, but Regirock is at +2 as well as in Sand to protect it from special attacks, so it isn't bad either. So they bring out their Regirock, and it becomes pretty obvious that they're going to attack it here. But because it's not weakness policy, I have absolutely no issue sending it as many +2 Drain Punches as I can. I could put these into P2, but since I know that it takes Max Knuckles easily, I wouldn't want to burn DPS into a Mon that can just recover anyway. Our Reflect more than negates their Life Orb, which means their Regirock's subpar attack is going into my Regirock's amazing defense, and they have no way to boost our damage while ours is already doubled. On top of that, they, with the Reflect up, they go for a Max Quake into our Regirock. We eat it up easily, and we get our weakness policy to boost us up to +4, and then heal most of it back up with a super effective Drain Punch into their Regirock. They also mess up by setting Trick Room, because it becomes apparent very soon that either the speed's high, or our Regirock is slower than theirs. As it turns out, our Regirock is indeed slower, which means we take advantage of their Trick Room. We use what was probably Grimm's last turn to set up a Fake Tears on P2, because we know we have Zapdos on our own P2 in the back to go to town on that -2 special defense. We also continue to Drain Punch their Regirock, since we know it's not putting much offensive pressure into ours. After that, we can just bring out P2, because Zapdos is definitely the play for after Trick Room ends. On their last turn of Max, we try to call a last-ditch attack into our Regirock with Protect. And even better, they double into our Regirock, including with P2, so it's about as good of a turn as it can get. Unfortunately, all of their Max Quake boosts will offset the big tiers we set, but at least P2 isn't unkillable now, because neutral is a big difference from +2. We do go for a Tri-Attack with our P2, but we don't get any status effects off of it. Now, my opponent does start to claw their way back in. They first called our Drain Punch onto Regirock with a Protect one turn, and then they switch the following turn to Rotom-H. Luckily, that means we just get an easy Drain Punch at +4 into their Rotom-H, and it negates most of the Ice Beam chip that they did to us using their Protect. After that, we call Rotom's Protect, and we go for a Drain Punch into P2, which continues to Ice Beam into Regirock and hopes of a freeze. We probably should have done this earlier, honestly, but I'd gotten a bit tunnel visioned onto their Regirock. Now, their P2 can recover some of this back next turn, but because we did more than 50%, we know that the kill is within reason. Now, this turn, we do get a little careless. With Trick Room over, we allow to double up into our Regirock, who doesn't get to recover much health at all, due to our P2's Tri-Attack not killing their P2. Luckily, they're now left with two very injured Mons, even with our Regirock gone, and we have a very healthy Zapdos and P2. Now, this turn, they call our Regirock's Protect by protecting their Rotom, but they incorrectly predict where we're going to attack with our P2. We managed to pick up the kill on their Regirock with an Ice Beam, so now it doesn't matter. We're in a 3 versus 1 situation, and Rotom would probably lose just the P2, so we're pretty much set to pick up this game. Now, my opponent is a great sport and doesn't forfeit. They, of course, killed Regirock on the next turn, but we just used that opportunity to cement our lead by recovering with P2. Zapdos comes out and finishes up the game and gives us our first set. So I actually started recording my second set a little late. It was against a player going by Q, whose real name is Jiseok. I might be mispronouncing that, probably. They got top 8 in the last NA Players Cup, and they absolutely destroyed me with their Spectrier team. We actually started off reasonably well, though. Went for a max cruise into this Togekiss going to follow me, lived the max Phantasm pretty handily, and then proceeded to set up Trick Room with our Porygon. This gives us a +1 on both of our special attackers and speed control over both of our opponents as well. Unfortunately, things start to go downhill in the fall. They call the next turn perfectly. So first they switch out their Togekiss for Incineroar, which it's going to take the Ice Beam that I used from P2 into that Togekiss slot absolutely perfectly. On top of that, they use Max Guard with their Spectrier. So in this position, they have blocked my Vine Lash, which will not get off because, unfortunately, Venusaur is within range of the Flare Blitz from Incineroar, who now underspeeds under the very Trick Room that I set. The best play that I could run here was doubling into that Togekiss slot with Vine Lash, so at least I could set it for the residual. My calc showed that Venusaur was easily within range of Flare Blitz, so I did the only thing I could and moved through it. I had no good switch-ins because I wanted to preserve Torkoal under the Trick Room, and I ate a Flare Blitz on Zapdos. This switch from Spectrier to Urshifu is kind of weird. I'm not sure what their motivation was, but it actually worked perfectly because even with Trick Room up, they have a great matchup with Urshifu with it. The next turn just puts the nail in the coffin. Incin goes ahead and kills Zapdos with Flare Blitz, which was scared of the Detect because of Urshifu. And we actually get a paralysis with our Tri-Attack from P2 after this. But even this hurts us. The paralysis from Static and Tri-Attack respectively mean that both of my opponent's Mons now underspeed my Venusaur set. We do at least have Torkoal in Trick Room now, but there's only one Trick Room turn left to use Eruption, and our Venusaur's up to 10%. After that, they use their Urshifu to the best of its ability with an Aqua Jet to weaken my Eruption, and then a Flare Blitz in the Sun to kill my Venusaur. Eruption does at least pick up the KO on Urshifu and do a good bit of damage to Incin, but even without the Aqua Jet, I don't think we'd have killed. Trick Room ends after this, Spectrier comes out, and at that point, I pretty much had to kill. I wanted to try and correct my targeting mistakes from last game using the same lead, but they made a great adjustment to Venu P2 and opened with Incineroar. I eventually panicked and went for Sleep Powder and Trick Room, even though Fake Out into P2 and Phantasm into Venusaur would counter me completely. They ended up hedging against Sleep Powder and went for Fake Out Phantasm, so I at least get Trick Room up on this turn. With Trick Room up and my opponent's Mon's more than capable of tanking an Eruption, I decided to bring out Regirock and go for a Max Knuckle into the Incin slot. Unfortunately, they also called this and swapped Incineroar for Rillaboom, which could ignore Trick Room with its Grassy Glide priority, and take the Knuckle pretty well too. After this, I swap out P2 for Torkoal to get my Trick Room Eruption from Sun, but I stupidly go for a Max Rockfall into Spectrier. Even at +1, this doesn't kill, and it ruins my own weather. This was a tilt, and the correct play here was to use Max Guard to allow Regirock to survive one more turn, and to preserve Torkoal's Sun to continue spamming Eruptions afterwards. At this point, the game is pretty much decided. I try to pull it back with Trick Room Eruptions, but this switch from Spectrier into Incineroar absolutely puts the nail in the coffin for my chances. These two are able to stall out Trick Room while chipping Torkoal to hold out for Urshifu and Spectrier in the endgame when Trick Room is gone. Eventually, my opponent just overwhelms me, and this double into P2 to prevent Trick Room was the last play before I forfeited. Ultimately, both these games were winnable, but my mistakes with not double targeting with Vine Lash in Game 1 and not max guarding in Game 2 cost me. Still, my opponent was absolutely a step ahead of me, and they deserved this 2-0 win. Once again, I started recording late for this set, but this is yet another Sun Mirror against a player named Shep. And the video picks up after a fun set of interactions in which I trade my Grimm to get a kill on their Max Thundurus, using Fake Tears despite its Defiant ability and its greater speed than Zapdos. Unfortunately, after my good start, Venusaur is able to kill my Zapdos with its Chlorophyll boosted speed, and I made a mistake by choosing not to go for a double protect with Torkoal when I had no other better options. What's worse, the Sludge Bomb from Venusaur fails to pick up a KO against their P2, and the P2 gets a one-turn wake-up. I end up choosing to forfeit and move on to Game 2. For the next game, I decide to open with Regirock and Zapdos to handle both of their big potential threats, Venusaur and Thundurus, and then I put P2 and Venusaur in the back as insurance against their Regirock. They lead Thundurus and Incineroar into this game, so I swapped out Zapdos for my P2, fearing Snarl, Parting Shot, or even just a Flare Blitz. Their Max Lightning into the Regirock slot does basically nothing, and following that up, I have no idea why they taunted, since open team sheets revealed that we don't have Curse on Regirock. I put a Knuckle into the Incineroar slot, and we get super effective damage plus a +1 for the following turn. I know they have Max Guard on their Thundurus, so fearing that, I decide to go for a Rock Ball into the Incineroar and Ice Beam into Thundurus. I call this wrong, so it doesn't go as well as it could have if I just Rock Balled Thundurus, but calling the taunt and eliminating Incineroar while still doing chip to Thundurus is really nice, especially because Venusaur is in the back, and we eliminate one of its major threats. We proceed to mostly seal up this game by correctly protecting our Regirock against their Leaf Storm, then putting their Venusaur into Sand Chip range with a Sludge Bomb from our own. After that point, it becomes a 3 versus 1, and we eventually take down their Porygon with boosted Drain Punches and our full health Zapdos in the back from the beginning. I use the same Regirock Zapdos lead in Game 3, but they adjust with a Venusaur P2 lead. I decide to swap Regirock from my P2 and go for an Airstream into their Venusaur. This switch was a solid call, since they do end up going for a Vine Lash into that slot, but the Airstream actually works against us. Flare would have been a much better call here, since not only would have bypassed the Proba Berry that I knew about from Open Team Sheet, and activated their Venusaur's Chlorophyll, that would make it slow under Trick Room that they then go ahead and set with their P2. I do this the next turn, but into P2 instead of Venusaur, which is a mistake that turns out to cost me my P2 and eventually the game. On the third turn of Dynamax, they call my strategy perfectly by max guarding with their Venusaur. Their P2 then proceeds to easily eat up a Drain Punch from my Regirock before bringing my Zapdos into an easy KO range the following turn. At this point, they have me down 4-2, and the game is more or less over. This means that I'm at 2 set losses, and I can only afford one more before my tournament life is over. For the fourth set, we face a player named Dev in yet another Sun Mirror. Are you seeing a pattern yet? I decided to open with Zapdos and Grimmsnarl, then P2 Torkoal in the back to potentially clean up the Trick Room. Since they open with Landorus and Whimsicott, I then end up swapping Zapdos for P2 while setting up Reflect with my Grimmsnarl. They use Tailwind and then attack with Landorus, and this allows us to reposition virtually for free. With this new board position, I choose to use Ice Beam on the Whimsicott, because their team sheet shows me that it was Mental Herb rather than Focus Sash, and I was pretty sure it would taunt me. I also set up Fake Tears on their Landorus slot in hopes of hitting it in the following turn, but unfortunately Prankster works against me in this case because they decide to U-turn out into their Urshifu. Luckily, the Ice Beam from P2 does end up putting an Oko onto Whim, so we're still in a very solid position. Predicting a close combat into P2 from their Urshifu, I consider my P2 a win con against Landorus, so I swap it out for Zapdos. This is rough since we also eat a Rock Slide, but Grimmsnarl gets to bring their Urshifu down to Sash, so I ultimately consider this turn a win. Despite them still having Tailwind up for a turn, I decide not to detect on Zapdos due to Urshifu's Unseen Fist. Luckily for me, they overpredict and swap it into Venusaur. Zapdos manages to take another Rock Slide, and then I manage to get a Fake Tears Heat Wave combo off that does big damage into both of my targets. On top of that, Tailwind ends after this turn, so Zapdos is now the fastest thing on the field. They decide to preserve their Venusaur by swapping it into Urshifu, and then they max their Landorus to take another hit. But because we're still faster, there's nothing to lose by going for yet another Fake Tears and then Heat Wave. This will do heavy chip into the Landorus, since it's now at -4, and it finishes off their sashed Urshifu. Of course, they do manage to set up their own Sand with the Rock Ball KO, so they would have killed their own Urshifu anyway. Now, despite us being in a great position, this is where it gets scary because I made the mistake of bringing Torkoal over Venusaur, and they have Sleep Powder pressure in the endgame. I stall their max for a turn by protecting Torkoal and setting up Light Screen, but the threat of Sleep Powder still lingers even though we've survived this turn. With their last turn of max, they choose to double into my Torkoal. This gives them +2 special defense against the P2 I have in the back. Luckily, Torkoal does take the Earth Power though, meaning that Grimmsnarl is free to score a Spirit Break into Venusaur. This neuters it offensively, but it still leaves its Sleep Powder option intact, so the situation hasn't changed all that much. This is maybe my favorite play of the tournament. I predicted a Sleep Powder into my P2, which threatens both of my opponent's Pokemon with Ice Beam. Knowing this, I decide to max my injured Grimmsnarl to set up Misty Terrain with a max Starfall and leave my opponent with just a -1 Venusaur against the world. Luckily for me, their Sleep Powder misses anyway, and we're able to finish them off in the following turn. With that said, I actually don't think the miss mattered at all because my Grimmsnarl is heavily invested in Spadef, and it should take at least one -1 Sludge Bomb while maxed. Plus P2 would eventually wake up in Ice Beam. In Game 2, we learn from our mistakes and bring Venusaur over Torkoal with a P2 lead to boot. This is a mixed start for us, as they score a crit U-turn with Landorus into our Venusaur, as well as render our Sleep Powder invalid by pivoting into their own Venusaur. But we at least managed to score yet another Ice Beam Oko onto their Whimsicott on turn 1. Now, in this position, fearing Sleep Powder or Vine Lash from Venusaur, I choose to swap P2 out for Zapdos. We actually do call the Vine Lash, but Rock Slide is still a powerful pin with that, doing heavy damage to our Zapdos. Luckily for us, the open team sheet gives us the knowledge that their Landorus is AV rather than Lumberry, so we get the chance to fire off a Sleep Powder in exchange for our Zapdos. And it connects. At this point, despite my Venusaur being fairly damaged from the crit U-turn on turn 1, I decide that having my own Vine Lash up is still important for the residual damage. Their Landorus hasn't taken its mandatory sleep turn yet, so I decide it's safe to fire off my own Vine Lash and Ice Beam into Lando. In retrospect, Ooze and Ice Beam might have been a better play to get +1 and to delay my own Vine Lash residual, but it ultimately doesn't matter because their Water Urshifu is their last mon. Now, I didn't calc this, but I feared a close combat from their Urshifu that would outspeed my Venusaur. I react by switching Torkoal into the P2 slot to get the Chlorophyll boost. This does actually work, allowing my Venusaur to fire off a Vine Lash that will end up killing the Urshifu at the end of the turn when the residual takes care of its Focus Sash, but it also results in the sacrifice of my Torkoal. The endgame now becomes their healthy Venusaur against my injured Venusaur and Porygon 2, but I still have a turn of Dynamax. Now, the game ends with me getting lucky and avoiding another Sleep Powder. Unlike last game, this one almost certainly mattered because I was able to get Trick Room up using the knowledge from previous turns that my Venusaur underspeeds theirs. Ice Beam and Sludge Bomb will clean up the following turn, which gives me the set and keeps me in the tournament. Sometimes it's just the game we play. Jumping straight into set 5, I faced a player named Tid with a really cool team including Life Orb Milotic and a bulky Turtonator. I led Venusaur Grimmsnarl into their Amoongus P2 lead, which was solid so long as I got a little lucky. I swapped Grimm into Zapdos to eat up Amoongus' Spore using my safety goggles, then managed to successfully Sleep Powder their P2, so turn 1 was about as good as it could have got. I decide to use Heat Wave with Zapdos and Max Ooze into the Amoongus, which was a solid move, but it is a bit annoying that Venusaur is slower than Zapdos, so the +1 to special attack comes after Zapdos' attack. My opponent definitely panics after this point because they use Spore into Venusaur, although I guess it could have been a timeout as well. We get a little unfortunate on the next turn and miss our +1 Heat Wave into their P2, but it does at least pick up the KO on Amoongus. Still, the +1 Vine Lash falls short of the KO on P2, and I'm pretty sure it was due to that miss, so the P2 is able to set up Trick Room after tanking Vine Lash. After this, our opponent brings out their Life Orb Milotic and immediately maxes it, going for a Hailstorm into our Zapdos slot. Luckily, I read this and swapped in Grimmsnarl, who takes it reasonably well. Their Porygon 2 then uses its slow speed under Trick Room to get an Eerie Impulse off onto my Venusaur, which is rough, but luckily the P2 is injured enough that a Max Quake from Venusaur manages to pick up the KO anyway. Between special defense boosts and a potential light screen the next turn, I'm not too worried about their Milotic, even with its Life Orb and its ice coverage for both my Venusaur and my Zapdos. Their final mon in this game is Turtonator. We get light screen up to minimize damage from both of our opponents, and Burning Jealousy from Turtonator does effectively nothing despite type advantage. Their Quake does chunk our Grimmsnarl a bit, but we're not too worried about that. Finally, I get a bit fortunate and get a Sleep Powder off into the Max Milotic, which more or less seals up Game 1 for us. This turn, there's nothing to stop me from risking a Protect and going for Fake Tears and Earth Power into the Turtonator. Luckily, it doesn't Protect, and we managed to get this Earth Power off. Now, Venusaur has taken the Eerie Impulse, so it's effectively just a neutral Earth Power, but with the type advantage, combined with Hail and Vine Lash residual damage, this puts us in a 4v1 situation where their 1 is the Milotic that's still asleep. Our opponent ends up forfeiting the following turn. In Game 2, we go with the exact same 4 and the same lead, but our opponent attempts to adjust by leading with Grimmsnarl and Landorus. Predicting a fake out and potential attack into my Grimmsnarl, I swap it for P2 while going for a Vine Lash into Landorus, which works reasonably well despite Landorus' impressive bulk. On the next turn, their Landorus' Max Quake just falls short of the KO onto RP2, which is absolutely great news. Unfortunately, we don't get to use this Ooze-boosted Ice Beam onto their Landorus, because Grimmsnarl does finish it off, but this does save our Venusaur from taking a -1 from Spirit Break. It's also not really the end of the world, because this Max Ooze is more just making up lost ground against their special defense boost for Max Quake. It wasn't going to end up doing a huge amount of damage despite the type advantage. After my P2 goes down, I bring out Grimm for a Reflect. My opponent goes for Rockfall with Landorus, which honestly doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, because despite the Koa Berry on Venusaur, either of Landorus' stabs would have been better damage and given him the boost, but I'm not complaining about mistakes. My Vine Lash then does really solid damage into Landorus, and our Grimmsnarl tanks the Spirit Break from theirs thanks to the Reflect it just set up. Vine Lash then proceeds to kill their Grimmsnarl and bring their Landorus into residual damage range for after the next turn. Because their Landorus is within residual damage range, I feel safe focusing on their P2. I hit it with a Fake Tears to set up for my special attackers in the back, and then go for Sleep Powder because my 4th is Zapdos and I really want to avoid Trick Room if I can help it. I do manage to hit the Sleep Powder, so despite Grimmsnarl going down, we're in a great position going forward. P2 has already taken its mandatory sleep turn, so I decide to double into it this turn. The -2 from Fake Tears from before Grimm went down is absolutely massive and gives us a clean KO. Meanwhile, their Turtonator goes for Burning Jealousy, and even without boosts or Light Screen this time, Venusaur handles it just fine. We clean up this Turtonator the following turn with Earth Power and Thunderbolt, which gives me a 3-2 record for the tournament so far. Set 6 puts me up against a player named Firefly, who has another very cool team featuring a Perish Song, Alolan Marowak, and a Choice Scarf Regidrago. I lead Venusaur P2 into it, but seeing the Marowak on turn 1, I elect to swap to Regirock. This turns out to be a correct call, but they fake out P2, so ultimately this turn leaves the game mostly even. My opponent responds predictably by swapping Marowak out, bringing in their Tapu Fini, presumably fearing a rock attack. Their Spirit Break goes into my P2, which is less than ideal since I would like to keep my special attack up, but we at least get Rock Slide and Trick Room off completely unhindered, which is certainly a nice start. I'd say we're in a much better position than we led. My opponent then makes a very nice play by going for Fake Tears into my P2, followed by Muddy Water. We do manage to pick up the kill on Grimmsnarl after this, but this Muddy Water obviously hurts both of our mons a lot since Regirock is weak to it, and its special defense is something to write home about. The upside is that the Muddy Water does proc Regirock's weakness policy, so this should allow Regirock to go out with a bang before we inevitably let it go down. Maxing it probably wouldn't be smart. My opponent then brings out their Celesteela and immediately maxes it. This is a smart play because they're almost certainly picking up a Beast Boost from one of my mons or the other. We do get Drain Punch in for Chip on it to allow Torkoal to pick up the kill later and then recover with P2. Their Muddy Water actually fails to pick up the KO on Regirock, which allows P2 to live another day. Avoiding a double KO on this turn is really crucial. On the next turn, I had a big choice to make. I know their Celesteela has Assault Vest thanks to the open team sheets, and unfortunately, they're just out of range of an Eruption despite that +2 Drain Punch. So this game was Torkoal's turn to max. Even Flare actually fails to pick up the KO on this AV Celesteela, which is just a testament to how bulky it is, but luckily I Venusaur saw that as a possibility with a Calc, and put an Ice Beam into it with P2. That gives us just the last bit of damage we need, and we take out their Dynamax. Their Fini gets a Calm Mind boost after this, though, so they're very much still in the game despite my Venusaur in the back. My opponent brings out their Alolan Marowak, and despite the obvious Protect, I choose to launch a Max Quake into it anyway. My reason for this is just simple risk versus reward. Even if I call the Protect, all I'd get is a Max Quake into a +1 Spadef Tapu Fini with a non-stab move, and if they call me going for Fini, then I'm going to take huge damage from that Marowak in the sun. My P2 is permitted to recover, and their Fini goes for yet another Calm Mind. So their Fini is getting dangerous, but notably for our Venusaur in the back, Misty Terrain will end at the conclusion of this turn, and so does Trick Room. This means that Sleep Powder is a possibility. With Trick Room gone, my opponent doubles into Torkoal. Luckily, the sun and its sheer physical bulk allows it to take both attacks with ease, and we take out their Marowak with another Max Quake into that slot. Fini is still extremely boosted against my all-special team, though, so my opponent still has a clear out in that Pokemon. This next turn absolutely belongs to my opponent. Muddy Water double connects and kills Torkoal without issue. Luckily, we do call this turn and recover with P2, which leaves Venusaur as our endgame win con. After my opponent protects for a turn for Leftovers recovery, we manage to nail a Sleep Powder on Fini since the Misty Terrain is gone. Unfortunately, our Porygon's Tri-Attack barely chips their Fini more than its Leftovers heals, thanks to all those special defense boosts, so this game is pretty much all up to Venusaur. By a great stroke of luck, Venusaur's Sludge Bomb crits their Fini. They manage to wake up, though, after one turn, but it's close enough for P2 to just take it out. Venusaur would normally take 3 turns to KO a +2 special defense Fini, so this crit was probably game-changing. But it was going to come down to RNG with the sleep turns anyway, so I'm fairly happy with how this went. In Game 2, I brought the same Mons, but they elected to adapt by leading Grimmsnarl Regidrago. Because their Regidrago was Scarfed, I assumed they would try their best to stop Trick Room from going up. So I tried to read a fake-out Dragon Energy by swapping P2 for Torkoal and going for a Chlorophyll-boosted Max Quake. Unfortunately for me, they either didn't consider Trick Room, or they read me perfectly, and they choose to use Scary Face to slow down my Venusaur. That allows their Dragon Energy to have spread damage that Oko's Torkoal, and still chipping my Max Venusaur significantly. This more or less sets up the end of the game already on turn 1. I attempt to salvage the game by going for Trick Room with Porygon, but unfortunately the fake tears onto Venusaur, plus a crit onto my P2, just really helped to seal this game up for my opponent. I managed to get Vine Lash and Trick Room up, but my team is severely wounded and 1 down, and I only have 1 turn of max remaining. Meanwhile, my opponent still has all 4 of their Mons and a full Dynamax to burn. My opponent decides to use their Grimmsnarl's last turn to set up for their Mons in the back with a fake tears onto my Porygon. I do manage to pick up a double KO this turn and get a +1 on both of my special attackers, but after this, their Fini and their Celesteela come out. Both of those Mons underspeed Venusaur despite the Scary Face due to my Chlorophyll boost, and both of my Mons are at -2 special defense. While the Trick Room was necessary for me to play around the Regidrago, it ultimately is my downfall in the later turns of this game. After my opponent maxes their Celesteela, they easily KO Venusaur, who is unable to protect itself during the remaining turns of my own Trick Room. I fish for conditions with Tri-Attack, but my own Sun prevents a freeze condition, which is probably the only thing that might have saved me here. My Regirock does manage to protect and get itself a weakness policy proc, but it's just too little too late, and my opponent takes game 2. In Game 3, I adapt by taking the same lead, but bringing my Zapdos in the back to handle Celesteela and Fini. I also choose to keep my Porygon 2 in on turn 1, which pays off despite the fake tears Dragon Energy combo. My Venusaur almost Okos their Grimmsnarl with Ooze, and P2 sets up Trick Room, establishing our speed control. I was then pleasantly surprised when my opponent opted to keep their Regidrago in, despite it being Choice Scarf locked onto an HP-dependent move. This allows me to hit a +1 Ice Beam onto it. Grimm does manage to pick up a KO, but P2 did its job with that damage and setting Trick Room. The damage puts Regidrago in Vine Lash range, and we also killed Grimm with residual damage. My adaptations continue to pay off as my opponent brings out Tapu Fini and Celesteela once again, while I bring in my Torkoal under Trick Room. Their Fini of course protects, but Torkoal's Eruption still does over 50% to the Dynamaxed Assault Vest Celesteela, which is amazing. Their Celesteela of course manages to kill Torkoal with a Rock Fall, but once again, Torkoal did its job, so that's fine. Venusaur throws out a Quake to boost special defense, since it was doing almost no damage to Celesteela regardless of the protect on Fini, so this boost is all we can hope for here. This next turn was a combination of good reads and luck on my part. I correctly detect with Zapdos in an attempt to ride out my own Trick Room, since Celesteela was probably going to target it with Max Rock Ball, and does. My Venusaur takes an accuracy drop from this Tapu Fini Muddy Water, which was very scary at the time, but we still managed to get the Sleep Powder off onto their Celesteela, which is unsupported by my opponent's Misty Terrain due to its flying typing. Meanwhile, Vine Lash still continues to do its residual damage after the turn ends. Before Trick Room expires, and taking advantage of the fact that Zapdos detected last turn, their Fini makes a last-ditch effort to KO it before it can take out their Celesteela. Luckily, I hadn't given it an opportunity to set up any Calm Mines, and Zapdos manages to hold on. Sludge Bomb from my Venusaur takes out the unboosted Fini, and Thunderbolt puts Celesteela into Vine Lash range to seal up Game 3. This gives us the set, and puts us into set number 7 of the tournament. My final opponent was Clipperz, a player who frequently tops the Showdown ladder and ended up making top 8 in this tournament after they slaughtered me here. They were running a Gothitelle Regieleki team, but this team also featured an AV Glastrier as their Sun counter, which unceremoniously put an end to my tournament run. Gothitelle prevents switches, and Venusaur was definitely going down to a Hailstorm. I tried to make my opponent choose what to go for by going with Sleep Powder and Eruption, but of course the combo of Dynamax, AV, and Hail changing the weather meant that the Fake Out Hailstorm combo into Venusaur resulted in even a full-strength Eruption from Torkoal doing fairly little into their Glastrier. On top of this, they have the +1 from Chilling Neigh, and I really don't have a way out of it. Afterwards, I try to salvage the game by Dynamaxing Torkoal and going for Trick Room with P2. Unfortunately, my opponent hits a Blind Hypnosis and Max Quakes into Torkoal, doing more than 50% despite Torkoal's considerable physical bulk, considering how strong Glastrier is and the +1 from last turn. This also raises its team's special defense, such that my Flare doesn't even kill their Gothitelle, let alone Glastrier. After my Sleep Powder luck this tournament, I really can't complain, but it certainly didn't feel good to have the sleep tables turned on me. Fearing yet another Quake into Torkoal, I foolishly Max Guard. Of course, my opponent reads me here and elects to go with a Helping Hand Hailstorm into P2. Flare might have saved me since I had Zapdos in the back to use a Sun-boosted Heat Wave, and they bring out their Water Urshifu, which would have been weakened by the Sun. But this turn absolutely seals the game for me. Despite losing so handily, this was my only regrettable play due to the punishing leads matchup, as it may have allowed me to claw back in at least partially. My opponent cleans up this game the following turn with Surging Strikes and Icicle Spear. In Game 2, I attempt to adapt with a classic Venusaur P2 lead and go for Sleep Powder Trick Room, expecting another Hailstorm KO into Venusaur. I had hoped to bring out my Torkoal the following turn. Of course, my opponent is a lot better than that and sees through my plan. They elect to fake out Venusaur to prevent the Sleep Powder, and then just chip P2, allowing it to set up Trick Room. Their Glastrier then uses my own Trick Room to kill Venusaur the following turn, and Gothitelle reverses it at the end of the same turn to prevent my Torkoal from taking advantage of it afterwards. In a last-ditch effort to salvage this game, I max my Registeel and fire off a Max Knuckle into Glastrier. Unfortunately, my inability to switch, thanks to Gothitelle, leaves Porygon a sitting duck, for a Helping Hand +1 Max Knuckle, boosting their Glastrier all the way up to +3. At this point, Torkoal comes in without Trick Room, and Glastrier is still outside of my Rockball KO range, leaving the game over. In retrospect, I think leading Regirock was probably my only possible lead into this matchup, but even then, my opponent would have multiple chances to hit a Hypnosis on me unless I ignore Glastrier entirely, which is also very dangerous. Clipperz clearly deserve this win, both in terms of team building and just their game sense, and I'll definitely be sure to keep this team archetype in mind when building my own teams, and maybe even I'll try it in the future. Hey, if you stuck through all of that, thanks so much for watching. I'll be back to playing more creative teams with my next video, but it'll probably take about a week because I'm out of town this weekend. I'm skipping the rental code for this video because this team is just so similar to an already popular one, but I'm still putting the paste in the description as always. Until next time.